So good morning, everyone. I'm Lucy Smith from the MBRRACE team in Leicester, and I'm pleased to be able to share the work with you this morning around looking at perinatal mortality by gestational age and looking at inequalities with respect to deprivation and ethnicity. It's particularly poignant to be able to share this with you this week as it's Baby Loss Awareness Week. And as we talk about these high rates of mortality, I'd really like to reiterate that we recognise that behind every one of these high numbers is the figures of families affected by the untimely loss of their babies and the impact it also has on many of you as healthcare professionals caring for them. So I'm going to, as I said, first of all, talk about gestational age differences in stillbirth and neonatal mortality rates. So our report provides both neonatal and stillbirth rates by gestation for the 5 years up to 2020. And just a reminder, firstly, that while only 7% of babies are born preterm before 37 weeks, they actually make up 70% of the deaths we see in the UK. And when you look at earlier gestations, that discrepancy is even more striking, with 1.5% of babies being born very preterm before 32 weeks gestation. They actually represent over 50% of deaths. So that's a really striking difference. And one of the reasons actually we've seen an overall fall in stillbirth rates and neonatal death rates is due to the reduction in preterm birth rates that we've seen. I don't know if you can see here the fall over the 5 years, and it equates to the number of babies being born before 32 weeks has reduced from 1.44% in 2016 to 1.34 in 2020. And that has a real knock-on effect because those babies are at such high risk of how many stillbirths and neonatal deaths we see. So that has an impact on the overall mortality rates. For stillbirths, the main reduction we still see in mortality is for those babies born at term, reducing over time from 2016 to 2020 by around 20%. But if we look at earlier gestations, we're seeing very little change in stillbirth rates for babies born from 28 to 36 weeks. So that we're not seeing a similar step change in mortality for these babies. In terms of neonatal death rates by gestational age, again, as we said, over 70% of babies who died were born before 37 weeks of pregnancy. And the biggest fall we've seen in mortality rates for neonatal death is for those babies born at less than 28 weeks, where we've seen a fall from 159 deaths per 1,000 births in 2016, coming down to 135 deaths per 1,000 births in 2020. So a real fall in mortality there. But at later gestations, we're seeing very little difference in the neonatal mortality rates for those births from 28 weeks gestation onwards. So in terms of recommendations, we've seen the implementation of successful national initiatives, particularly those reducing mortality of term stillbirths. But we really need to monitor the impact on reducing preterm birth and try and reduce those stillbirth and neonatal death rates in those babies born preterm. And also just a reminder about the MBRRACE UK guidance for improving the consistency of how we assess signs of life of babies born before 24 weeks gestational age. Last year, we introduced one of the videos that we have developed for looking for a guide for healthcare professionals assessing signs of life in these very tiny babies. And now on our website, we've got 3 videos there: a longer clinical guide that gives a full overview, a quick clinical guide that can get you up to speed if you need a refresher, and then a summary for parents and families. And it's really important we try and improve the consistency of how we report the deaths of these very early gestational babies, really to ensure we reduce the distress experienced by parents when we have that inconsistency in approach. So now I'm going to talk through the findings we have on ethnicity and deprivation. If you look in the tables of the perinatal mortality surveillance, you'll see the rates that we standardly provide around inequalities with respect to deprivation and with respect to ethnicity separately. And they show a consistent wide gap in mortality between the least and most deprived groups, and also between the white population and other babies of other ethnicities, particularly Asian and Black populations. And that difference does not seem to be reducing. But what we wanted to do in the main report was really focus on taking a deeper dive, looking at more detailed deprivation, detailed ethnicity with combined with deprivation here. So Ruth Matthews had been leading some work with MBRRACE UK, looking at more detailed stillbirth rates by ethnicity, really looking at different groups of babies of different Asian ethnicities and different Black ethnicities to see if there was any variation in the mortality we see for these groups. So today I'm just going to take you through that data. On the right, you can see we've produced this as a heat map, so you can see the lowest rates are portrayed by this paler yellow colour, going down to the highest rates portrayed by this dark purple. So just first of all, looking at the mortality rates in the babies of white ethnicity, you can see that in the least deprived, those rates are around 2.78 per thousand births, and they rise to 4.57 per thousand births. So they increase with increasing deprivation. But when we look for babies of other ethnicities, there's a really stark pattern. For babies of mixed and multiple ethnicity, the rates are slightly higher than the white population, and again slightly higher for babies of Indian ethnicity. But there are really strikingly high rates for babies of Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Black Caribbean and Black African ethnicity. For example, you can see in this in babies of Black African ethnicity, their rates range from the least deprived being 5.77 per thousand births up to 8.1 per thousand births. So a really stark difference. And generally, even for babies living in the least deprived areas of Asian and Black ethnicities, they're experiencing higher levels of stillbirth than babies of white ethnicity in the most deprived areas. And then when we apply the differences in the number of the proportions of the population experiencing deprivation, we see a really quite striking pattern. So for babies of white ethnicity, around 1 in 3 babies are born to living in the most deprived areas. But when we look for other populations, can see that Babies of Indian ethnicity are fairly similar, with around 1 in 3 living in the most deprived areas. For babies of mixed and multiple ethnicity, it's slightly higher at just under 1 in 2. But when we look at babies of Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Black Caribbean and Black African ethnicity, it's around 2/3 of babies are living in areas of deprivation. So babies from Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Black Caribbean and African ethnicities are twice as likely to be born in areas of deprivation than babies of white ethnicity. And when we apply those rates to the heat map, you can really see this stark pattern that these higher rates of mortality seen in the most deprived areas are affecting much larger proportions of the population than seen for babies of white ethnicity. And that really emphasizes the combined effect of both ethnicity and deprivation for these populations. And these are very worrying patterns. We can see similar effects for neonatal mortality. For babies of white ethnicity, we're seeing rates of neonatal mortality ranging between 1.26 in the least deprived areas up to 2.14 in the most deprived areas. But then when we look by ethnicity as well, bringing in the other babies of other ethnicities, you can see higher rates for babies of mixed and multiple ethnicity, and also Indian and Black Caribbean ethnicity, but particularly high rates for babies of Bangladeshi, Black African, and Pakistani ethnicity. And for example, babies of Pakistani ethnicity from the least deprived areas have rates of 2.57 per thousand births, compared to rates of 4.14 and 3.36 in the most deprived areas. And again, you can see that these rates in the least deprived areas for babies of Bangladeshi, Black African, and Pakistani ethnicity are considerably higher than seen for those of babies of the white ethnicity in the most deprived areas. And again, applying those patterns of experience of deprivation across the different ethnic groups, we see this really stark contrast of those higher rates of mortality being experienced by much larger proportions of the population for babies of Bangladeshi, Black African, and Pakistani ethnicity. So going forward, how can we try and deal with these wide inequalities? We reiterate those recommendations around needing a multi-agency targeted approach across all points of the reproductive, pregnancy and neonatal healthcare pathway. Really need to focus on that multi-dimensional effect of deprivation ethnicity, recognizing those difference of experience of mortality between babies of different Asian and Black ethnicity, seeing those very high rates for babies of Pakistani and Bangladeshi and Black African ethnicity particularly. We also call for increased harmonisation of data across the 4 nations of the UK. At the moment, routine data on ethnicity is collected slightly differently across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland in terms of how ethnicity is recorded on birth notifications. And also there's no consistent measure of deprivation across all the 4 nations. And combined with these 2 effects make it very difficult to facilitate direct population comparisons. And so it's really important that we make a call for that kind of data. And going forward, again, how can we help this? So MBRRACE-UK are undertaking a confidential inquiry into the care of both Black and Asian women who've experienced a stillbirth or neonatal death. And we hope this, the findings of this confidential inquiry, which will be published next autumn, will really help to shed some light on understanding these wide disparities and how then we can, that can feed into national strategies to really tackle these inequalities and make a difference from those for those women from ethnic minority groups who are experiencing such high levels of stillbirth and neonatal death. Those families that are affected by these high rates of mortality, it will be so important to try and understand how we can reduce those in the future. Thank you.